All right, risk analyst and former diplomat Dr. Kingsley Makhubela joins us now for more on this. Dr. Makhubela, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this evening. So it's all systems go for the G20 Summit set to take place this coming weekend. If we talk about this from a diplomatic perspective, how does South Africa's hosting of the summit reflect in our evolving role with regards to global governance and international diplomacy?
Good evening, Katleo, thanks very much for the invitation. On the 22nd and the 23rd, you would essentially have a summit. Now, a summit is a meeting of heads of state and government. And a summitry as a diplomatic tool has been very useful, going back to the end of the Second World War, the Alta Summit, you will recall, that really brought the Allied leaders together. But summits have played a very crucial role in reaching and fostering consensus, particularly around controversial issues around the world. So this summit would unfortunately not have participants of key heads of state. But the absence of key heads of state does not mean that the summit would not carry on. Those who are there will carry on and take some decision. The summit, Katleho, has been a mechanism to short-circuit a meeting of senior officials who keep on referring or deferring to their capitals, because the capitals will be here, their heads of state and heads of government will be here. These are people who will be taking decisions. So the unfortunate part is that you are having a sizable numbers of heads of state who won't be here. For whatever reason, you would have President Putin, he won't be here. President Trump won't be here. President Milley won't be here. The president of Mexico won't be here. And Lula is likely not to be here because he's hosting the COP 30. So I'm not sure about MBS Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. He is having a meeting tomorrow with President Trump. I don't know if he will travel from there to here. So you are having a sizable number of heads of state won't be attending, unfortunately. And it diminishes and it takes away that aura that comes with a summit.
But are there any diplomatic opportunities that are presented to South Africa because of the absence of some of these countries with regards to the influence of then maybe some of those outcomes in the G20 summit?
Well, being in the G20 has been very useful for South Africa, not only for South Africa, but for the entire continent. Because South Africa, even in the past, has extensively consulted with members within the continent about critical issues affecting the continent and has elevated these issues to the G20. Not only the G20, even the outreach program of the G7, South Africa has participated with some member states. So they've already carried the aspiration of the continent in the summit. This summit would happen after the Brazil summit that really elevated issues of food security, with the huge challenge that all of us are facing, not only in the developing world, also in the developed world. They are facing serious challenges of food security. So this discussion here will deal with those issues. The issue of the global debt will feature very predominantly during the summit, but it seems there won't be consensus around these issues. As we know, ministers of finance in February could not agree, could not reach consensus, mainly because of the U.S. objection to some of the issues. The U.S. is objecting now to the leaders' consensus declaration, which if it comes, if really the U.S. insists on that, you are likely to have a joint communique or a leaders' communication. You are likely to come up with a statement of the host country, which is a watered-down part of the summit outcome. The ideal situation, Katle, would be to come up with a consensus document, because it shows the world, despite differences, can also come together, can reach consensus, particularly on issues that are very common, that are really affecting everyone across the board.
So does it defeat the purpose if then they don't come up with that consensus statement as opposed to one that's just watered down to say, well, we hosted the summit?
Well, you still carry on with the summit. It doesn't mean because there's no head of state, one head of state as opposes, it will only be unprecedented because you recall during the summit in Delhi, there was a lengthy discussion around the Ukraine-Russia war. And leaders could not agree for quite some time, till the last minute, where they reached consensus in terms of the language. And that language has helped to really unlock other related issues. This time around, because the United States has a blanket opposition to the leaders' communique, you are unlikely to get a consensus document coming out of the Johannesburg summit, which would be very unfortunate because it's the first time South Africa is hosting, the first time actually, that the G20 is hosted in the African continent. But this is happening, Katlego, within the context of the geopolitical frictions and the multipolarity that is emerging, that sometimes I think even South Africa finds it very difficult to navigate this new terrain. I mean, there are issues that I think we should have done in the past as a country. There are 4 issues, actually, that I think the president should have done in my own view. I think the president should have attended the inauguration of the president of Ghana. I think he should have gone to the funeral of the late Pope Francis. I think he should have attended the parade in Moscow, and he should have attended the parade in China celebrating the 80th anniversary of the defeat of the Japanese. Because during the preparation for the Chinese one, the Japanese government came up with a message that anyone who attends the military parade or the victory celebration in China, Japan would not take kind of that. I'm just paraphrasing what they came up with. So these are the nuances, actually, that are as a result of the emerging new powers and this multipolarity that I think South Africa finds it very difficult to navigate. And I think South Africa has to develop strategies to navigate these difficult issues moving forward.
It's just about those geopolitical realignments that South Africa needs to place itself correctly, but also in the context of BRICS. How does South Africa find those balancing acts and just balancing itself in not stepping on toes by not attending some of those parades where it seems as though then they're aligned with Japan, if maybe they're not?
You know, Katlego, it's a very challenging thing because within the country, you would realize even the narrative, it's much more skewed towards a very pro-American approach. But the Americans are no longer the only player in town. There are a multitude of new powers that have emerged. And some of these powers have identified their sources of power in the engagement with other powers within the global system. The Chinese have been very much nuanced in identifying their power. The Russians have done the same. I mean, as we are talking, yesterday, President Trump has signed a law that really imposes 500% tariffs on anyone doing business with Russia. But the US keeps on buying 16% of enriched uranium from the Russian Federation. If the Russian Federation were to stop sending that, it will send serious paralysis in the electricity grid of the United States. So the Russians have some leeway, some cuts to play in this case. The Chinese are using the rare earths to play their part. But I think there are other powers that have identified their sources of power in the engagement. It doesn't have to be conflictual. It has to be mutually beneficial in terms of this exercising of this power. And we haven't reached that equilibrium. We're just struggling now with squaring the angle, as one would say.
I mean, talking about those powers and trying to find that equilibrium, what role do you think that we as a country need to play in advocating for reform within the global financial institutions? I mean, those such as the IMF and the World Bank, particularly in a G20 framework.
You know, if you look at the global debt, take the global debt as it is now, it stands at about 333 trillion, if I'm not mistaken. But the global economy is 120 trillion. And if you look at the public sector debt, which is about $122 trillion, and the economy is not growing at par to be able to manage those issues. There's a need for structural reforms in some of these institutions. Totally overhaul them. As the Secretary General of the UN said, some of these institutions were meant for the post-Cold War, for the Cold War period. They're no longer relevant now. There's a need to do a reform. Same as the talk about the Security Council reform. But if you listen to even some members within the BRICS who are in the Security Council, in this case, Russia and China, are quiet about their position with respect to how they envisage a reformed Security Council. So you're going to find challenges around those issues, but they have to do with the realignment of forces given the new emerging powers. They want to see who is where. There's an institution that I sat in it when the Queen's Institute that developed some framework in terms of the reform. One of the options is it's to allow, with respect to the Security Council, one of the options is to allow the General Assembly to have an overriding two-thirds majority for any veto. Are members of the Security Council likely to accept that? It's a challenge that remains to be seen. So there are different positions that are postulated in terms of how to reform the Security Council. The Bretton Woods institution is becoming much more desperate because the Chinese now have started to launch their digital currency, moving away from the SWIFT, which a lot of financial people in the United States are saying the dollar has been weaponized, and they're moving away from that. So there's a change that is automatically happening, and that is unstoppable in terms of the new financial architecture that's emerging. The BRICS have formed the BRICS Developmental Bank and so on. So those are new financial institutions that are coming up. The new world must be able to interface and interact with these new institutions.